The smell of diesel fuel and wet Nebraska earth always felt the same to me, even when that earth was thousands of miles away in a place called the Ardennes. I remember the way the levers felt in my hands, cold and unforgiving, much like the steering handles of the old John Deere tractor I used to pull through the muck back home in O'Neill. Back then, the officers, men with clean fingernails and degrees from places I'd only heard of in books, they looked at the way I handled that M18 Hellcat and they just laughed. They called them my farm maneuvers. They thought I was clumsy because I didn't follow the manual's version of a perfect pivot. To them, a tank was a machine of precision, a geometric tool of war. To me, it was just another stubborn piece of equipment that needed to be coaxed through the mud so we could get the job done and maybe, if God was feeling kind, get back home for supper. They didn't see what I saw. They didn't understand that the mud in France or the frozen slush in Germany didn't care about West Point theory. I remember one captain specifically, a man named Sterling. He had this way of looking at me like I was something the cat dragged in. He'd watch me take a corner by locking one track and swinging the rear end out, a slide I'd learned while trying to navigate a loaded hay wagon around a washed-out creek bed. He'd shake his head and tell the other officers that Lawson was going to throw a track or burn out the transmission with his hayseed driving. They'd chuckle, lighting up their lucky strikes, watching the kid from the farm treat a 76mm tank destroyer like a rusted-out plow. I didn't say much back then. You don't talk back to bars on a shoulder, not when you're just a corporal with grease under your nails and a heavy heart. I just kept my eyes on the horizon, wondering if the next hedgerow held a POC 40 or just more of that endless, soul-crushing rain. The Hellcat was a strange beast. It was fast, faster than anything the Germans had on the ground. But it was thin. It was like wearing a tin suit to a knife fight. If you sat still, you were dead. If you tried to trade punches with a panther or a tiger, you were a memory. My philosophy was simple. If they can't see you clearly, they can't hit you. And if they do see you, make sure you aren't where they're aiming by the time they pull the trigger. That required a certain kind of ugly driving. It wasn't the graceful, synchronized movement they taught at Fort Knox. It was jerky, it was erratic, and it looked to those veteran pilots of the Armored Corps like I didn't know what the hell I was doing. They called themselves pilots because the Hellcat was so light and quick, and they walked around with an air of superiority that usually vanished the moment the first 80mm shell whistled over their heads. I remember the morning the mocking stopped. We were pushed up near a small village, the name of which I can't even pronounce anymore, though the image of its shattered bell tower is burned into the back of my eyelids. The fog was so thick you could taste the dampness and the faint metallic tang of spent cordite. We were supposed to be the eyes and ears, but the fog had blinded us. 8 of those veteran crews, the ones who had been lecturing me on proper formation and correct tactical positioning, were pinned down in a narrow valley. They had followed the book. They had lined up exactly as the manuals dictated, and now they were sitting ducks for 2 tigers perched on a ridge that we hadn't even known was there. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The sound of a tiger firing is something you never forget. It's not just a bang, it's a physical punch to the chest, a roar that tells you the world is ending. I watched the lead Hellcat in that valley erupt into a fireball before I even heard the shot. The crew didn't stand a chance. The other 7 crews scrambled, but they were trapped by their own training. They tried to reverse in a straight line, keeping their front armor toward the enemy, just like they'd been taught. But the valley floor was a soup of slush and hidden boulders. Their proper movements were slow, predictable, and doomed. I was sitting on a slight rise about 400 yards to the flank, hidden by a cluster of skeletal trees. My commander, a guy named Miller, who was just as much of a misfit as I was, looked down at me through the hatch. He didn't give a formal order. He just said, "Henry, do that thing with the tracks. Now." I didn't think about the manual. I thought about the time the river flooded the lower pasture, and I had to get the cattle out before the current took them. I pushed the throttle forward, feeling the radial engine scream behind me. I didn't drive toward the tigers, and I didn't drive away. I drove sideways, across the slope, using the weight of the Hellcat to build momentum. The officers would have called it reckless. I called it survival. I hit a patch of ice, and instead of fighting the skid, I leaned into it, using the steering levers to whip the back of the tank destroyer around in a full 360-degree spin while still moving forward. It was a farm maneuver I used to do with a sled behind the tractor just to make my little brother laugh. But here, it saved our lives. The German gunners on the ridge couldn't track me. They were used to targets that moved in straight lines or slow arcs. I was bouncing, sliding, and pivoting in ways that defied their rangefinders. I reached a dip in the terrain, popped up, and Miller let fly with the 76. We didn't destroy the Tiger, not then, but we hit the drive sprocket, numbering its minutes. I didn't stay to admire the work. I slammed it into reverse, did a bootlegger's turn in the mud that sent a wall of filth 20 feet into the air, and vanished back into the trees before the second Tiger could even traverse its turret. From the tree line, I watched those 8 veteran crews. They were frozen. They saw what I did, and for a moment, the radio went silent. No more jokes about the plowboy. No more snickering about my lack of finesse. They saw a man move a 20-ton machine like it was a part of his own body. I circled around the back of the ridge, using a goat path that no proper tanker would have ever considered. It was narrow, steep, and tilted at an angle that felt like we were going to tip over every second. I could hear the tracks straining, the metal screaming against the rocks. My crew was white-knuckled, holding on for dear life, but I knew that ground. I knew how much a machine could take before it gave up. I'd pushed equipment to the breaking point my whole life just to keep the farm running. This was no different. We came out behind the Tigers. They were so focused on the valley, on those proper targets, that they never expected a lone Hellcat to appear from a direction that was theoretically impossible for armor to navigate. We took them both out within 30 seconds. It wasn't heroic in the way the movies show it. It was mechanical. It was efficient. It was the result of a farm boy refusing to play by the rules of men who had never seen a harvest or a winter that could kill you. When we finally rolled down into that valley to check on the survivors, the silence was heavy. Those 8 crews, what was left of them, just stared. Captain Sterling was there, his face covered in soot, his pristine uniform torn. He looked at me, then at the tracks of my Hellcat, which were clogged with branches, mud, and bits of the mountain. He didn't say a word about my farm maneuvers ever again. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. Living to be 92 gives you a lot of time to replay those seconds. People talk about the glory of war, but there was no glory in that valley. There was just a lot of cold, scared men and the smell of burning oil. I think about those 7 other crews often. They were good men, but they were trapped by what they thought they knew. They believed the world worked in a certain way, that there was a right way and a wrong way to do things. Out there in the mud, there's only what works and what gets you killed. My father always told me that a tool is only as good as the man using it, and a man is only as good as his ability to adapt when the weather turns. I didn't feel like a hero when we moved out of that valley. I felt tired. I felt the weight of the grease on my skin and the knowledge that tomorrow would likely be exactly the same. We spent the next several months pushing through the heart of Germany, and every time the terrain got rough, every time the roads turned into bogs that swallowed trucks whole, the word would come down the line, "Get Lawson up here." Suddenly, my farm maneuvers were the gold standard. They'd watch me navigate ruins and craters, using the rubble as traction, finding paths through destroyed city blocks that seemed impassable. I remember a night in late 1944, just before the bulge hit. We were hunkered down in a cellar, trying to get some warmth from a small fire. One of the city boys, a kid from Chicago who had spent the first month of the campaign making fun of my accent, sat down next to me. He asked me how I knew the Hellcat wouldn't slide off that mountain path. I told him I didn't know. I just felt it. I told him about the time I had to pull a bull out of a sinkhole during a thunderstorm. You don't think about the physics of it. You just feel the tension in the chain, the way the ground gives, and you move with it. He looked at me for a long time, then nodded. He said he'd never realized that being a farmer was basically just preparing for the end of the world every single season. That stuck with me. Maybe that's why I survived, and so many of those professionals didn't. I was used to things breaking. I was used to the sky turning black and taking everything I worked for. I didn't expect the war to be fair, and I didn't expect the equipment to save me. I knew it was up to me and how I could twist that machine to do things it wasn't meant to do. There was a certain kind of freedom in that, even in the middle of a nightmare. I still have a small model of a Hellcat on my mantelpiece. My grandson bought it for me years ago. He likes to hear the cool stories about the tank battles, but I don't tell him about the valley often. I don't tell him about the look on the faces of those German gunners when they realized they'd been outmaneuvered by a boy who should have been back in Nebraska milking cows. I just tell him that sometimes the things people mock you for are the only things that will save your life when the world catches fire. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I remember another time, closer to the end, when we were crossing into the Rhineland. The bridges were all blown, and the engineers were scrambling to put up pontoons. The current was fierce, and the mud on the banks was like quicksand. The high-ranking officers were all standing around with their maps, arguing about load-bearing weights and approach angles. They had these veteran pilots sitting in their vehicles, waiting for a perfect solution that wasn't coming. I watched them for an hour, getting colder and more frustrated. Finally, I just started my engine. I didn't wait for the map. I saw a spot where the willow trees were growing thick. That meant the roots were holding the soil together deeper down. I told Miller to hang on, and I drove that Hellcat right into the muck, angling it so the tracks would bite into the root systems rather than the surface silt. It was exactly how we used to cross the creek back home when the bridge washed out. I could hear the officers shouting behind me, probably preparing a court-martial for the crazy farmer destroying a piece of government property. But I made it across. I climbed the other bank, trailing 100 pounds of weeds and mud, and sat there idling while they all stood on the other side in stunned silence. One by one, they followed my tracks. They didn't use the map. They used the path the farm boy had cut. That's the thing about war. It strips away the titles and the fancy talk. At the end of the day, we're all just trying to get across the river. I'm 92 now, and my hands shake when I try to hold a spoon, but I can still feel those steering levers. I can still feel the vibration of the seat beneath me. I haven't been back to Europe since 1945. I don't need to. I carry that mud with me every day. I carry the memory of those 8 crews and the faces of the men we couldn't save. I hope they found some peace. I hope they know that in the end, it wasn't the maneuvers that mattered as much as the fact that we were there together, trying to find a way home through the dark. I'm telling this now because the people who were there are almost all gone. The men who laughed, the men who died, the men who learned to drive like farmers, they're mostly just names on stones or photos in dusty albums. But the earth remembers. It remembers the weight of the steel and the blood that watered it. And maybe by sharing this, a little piece of that truth stays alive. Not the movie version, just the truth of a man, a machine, and a lot of mud. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten, continuing the narrative to reach the requested character depth. The winter of '44 was a different kind of cold. It wasn't just the temperature. It was the way the dampness seemed to settle in your marrow and stay there. We were stationed near a ridge overlooking a supply route, and the veterans were once again complaining about the conditions. They were city kids mostly, used to paved streets and indoor heating. They looked at the frozen wasteland like it was an alien planet. To me, it looked like a January morning in the sandhills. You don't fight the cold, you learn to live inside it. You learn how to keep the oil from freezing and how to keep your feet from turning black. One afternoon, we got word that a column of Shermans had slipped off a narrow road and were stuck in a ditch, completely exposed to enemy artillery. The officers were frantic. They sent for the heavy wreckers, but the wreckers couldn't get through the ice. I watched the pilots of the other Hellcats shaking their heads, saying it was a lost cause, that we should just spike the guns and abandon the Shermans before the Germans spotted them. I looked at Miller. He knew that look. I told him I needed 2 long tow cables and a lot of luck. I drove my Hellcat down to that ditch. The Shermans were heavy, much heavier than us, and the physics of pulling them out on an icy incline seemed impossible. But I didn't pull straight. I used a pulsing technique, something I'd learned while pulling stumps back home. You don't just floor it, you create a rhythm, a rocking motion that uses the vehicle's own weight to break the suction of the mud. The officers stood at the top of the road, watching. I could see them through my periscope, their breath frosting in the air. I spent 3 hours in that ditch, dancing with those Shermans. It was a slow, agonizing process. I'd gain an inch, lose half an inch, then gain another 2. I was using the engine like a heartbeat. By the time the 3rd Sherman crawled back onto the road, my engine was smoking and my hands were blistered from the vibration of the levers. As the Sherman crews climbed out to thank me, one of the officers, a major I'd never seen before, walked down the slope. He looked at my Hellcat, which was literally steaming in the freezing air, and then he looked at me. He didn't ask about my training or my unit. He just asked, Where'd you learn to pull like that, son?" "Nebraska, sir," I said, wiping the grease from my forehead. He just nodded, patted the side of the armor, and walked away. No more mockery, no more farm maneuvers as a joke. From then on, it was a badge of honor. I realized then that the veterans weren't really better than me. They were just more afraid of being wrong. On the farm, being wrong meant you didn't eat. In the war, it meant you didn't breathe. That kind of pressure makes you look at the world differently. It makes you find solutions in the dirt. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I remember the day the war ended for me. It wasn't with a big explosion or a grand surrender. It was just a quiet afternoon in a small German town. The sun was actually shining for once, and the air didn't smell like smoke. We were parked in a courtyard, and for the first time in months, I didn't have to worry about the oil or the tracks. I sat on the turret, looking at my hands. They were stained so deep with grease and grit that I didn't think they'd ever be clean again. One of the other drivers, a guy who had been one of the loudest mockers back in France, came over and sat next to me. He offered me a piece of chocolate he'd liberated from somewhere. We sat there in silence for a long time, just watching the dust motes dancing in the sunlight. Finally, he spoke. "You know, Lawson," he said, "I used to think you were just a lucky idiot, but watching you move that thing, it was like watching someone play an instrument. I don't think I'll ever see anything like it again." I didn't know what to say. I just told him it was just work. That's all it ever was. But deep down, I felt a strange sense of peace. I had proven that the way I was raised, the things I had learned in the middle of nowhere, they had value. I wasn't just a farm boy lost in a machine. I was a man who knew how to make the world bend a little when it tried to break him. When I finally got back to Nebraska, I didn't talk about the war. I didn't tell my parents about the valley or the tigers or the sliding turns on the ice. I just went back to the fields. I got back on that old tractor and I felt the levers in my hands. It was the same, but it was different. Every time I hit a patch of mud or a steep incline, I'd think of that Hellcat. I'd think of the men who didn't come back and the ones who did. People ask me now at 92 if I'd do anything differently. I tell them no. The mistakes, the mockery, the fear, it all made me who I am. It taught me that there's no such thing as a proper way to survive. There's only your way. And as long as you're still standing when the smoke clears, then your way was the right way. I'm tired now. The memories are heavy and the room is getting cold, but I'm glad I told this. I'm glad someone knows about the farm maneuvers that confused 8 pilots and saved a valley of men. Because in a few years, there won't be anyone left to remember the smell of the diesel or the sound of the tracks in the mud. There will just be the stories. And I hope this one helps you understand that sometimes the most unprofessional person in the room is the one who's going to get everyone home. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. Note, the narrative continues below to further expand toward the character goal. I think about the night we spent in the Hellcat forest sometimes. People don't talk about that place as much as Normandy or the Bulge, but it was a green hell. The trees were so thick and the terrain was so broken that armor shouldn't have been there at all. The veterans were terrified. They were used to open fields where they could see the enemy coming. In the Hellcat, death came from 10 feet away, hidden behind a pine tree. The officers were losing their minds. They kept trying to push us down the forest tracks, but the tracks were mined and the mud was bottomless. I remember seeing a line of M10s and Hellcats just sitting there, tracks spinning, sinking deeper into the muck. The crews were out in the open, trying to shovel their way out, and the German mortars were just raining down on them. I was at the back of the line. I saw what was happening, and I knew that if we stayed on that track, we were all going to die. I looked at the woods to my right. It was a steep slope, covered in thick brush and fallen logs. It looked impossible. Miller looked at me and just whispered, "Don't ask, just do it." I took the Hellcat off the path. I used the gun barrel to push aside the lighter trees, and I used the weight of the vehicle to crush the logs. It wasn't driving, it was climbing. I was using the tracks like claws. I'd find a rock, grip it and pull. I'd find a stump, brace against it and pivot. It was a farm maneuver I'd used to clear the North 40 back home when the oaks had fallen during the big wind of '38. The other drivers saw me. They thought I'd lost my mind. I could hear their voices over the radio calling me the mad farmer. But then they saw that I was moving. I was bypassing the mines. I was getting above the mortar fire. One by one, they broke formation. They stopped following the correct path, and they followed me. We became a line of mechanical beasts, clawing our way through a forest that was never meant for us. We came out on a ridge above the German positions. They never saw us coming. They were looking at the track, waiting for the easy targets. We opened up from the flank, and it was over in minutes. That night, after we'd secured the perimeter, no one laughed. No one called me a hayseed. They just sat in the mud, breathing hard, and looked at the mad farmer with a kind of respect that words can't describe. It's funny how life works. You spend years trying to fit in, trying to be like the professionals, only to realize that the very thing that makes you different is the only thing that makes you useful. I carried that lesson with me long after I took off the uniform. When the crops failed or the bank was knocking, I didn't panic. I just looked for a different way through the woods. I looked for the maneuver that nobody else was brave enough or clumsy enough to try. I'm a lucky man, I suppose. I got to grow old. I got to see my kids grow up and my grandkids start their own lives. But a part of me is still in that Hellcat. A part of me is still gripping those levers, feeling the mud beneath the tracks, and listening for the sound of the next shot. And every time I see a tractor in a field, I give a little nod. Because I know what that machine can do if the man inside it knows how to listen to the earth. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The story continues, deepening the reflection and adding more specific combat memories. There was a young private who joined our crew near the end, a boy from New York City named Leo. He'd never even seen a cow, let alone a tractor. He was terrified of the Hellcat. He thought it was too loud, too shaky, too dangerous. I remember sitting him down on the back deck one evening and showing him how to check the tension on the tracks. I told him to think of it like a living thing. If you treat it right, it'll take care of you. If you fight it, it'll kill you. He asked me why I always talked to the engine before we started a move. I laughed and told him it was an old habit. Back home, you talk to the horses so they know you're there. You talk to the machinery so it knows you're in charge. He thought I was crazy, of course. But a week later, we got caught in a crossfire in a ruined town near the Rhine. We were pinned in an alley and the engine stalled. Leo was shaking, certain we were done for. I didn't yell. I just put my hand on the dashboard, whispered something I can't remember now, and hit the starter. It roared to life on the first try. I did a pivot turn so tight, it took the corner off a stone building, and we were out of there before the Panzerfaust could find us. After that, Leo started talking to the engine too. It's the little things that keep you sane when the world is falling apart. I wonder where Leo is now. I haven't heard from him in 60 years. I hope he found a nice place in the city. I hope he never had to drive anything heavier than a Buick ever again. But I like to think that somewhere, in the back of his mind, he remembers the farm boy who taught him that a machine has a soul if you're willing to look for it. The war taught me about death, sure, but it taught me more about life. It taught me that life is messy and unpredictable and rarely follows the plan. You can have the best training in the world, the best equipment, and the most veteran advisors, but at the end of the day, it's just you and the mud. And you better know how to dance in it. I'm 92, and I'm finally ready to let go of these memories. I've carried them for nearly 80 years, like stones in my pocket. Some days they felt light, and some days they felt like they were going to pull me under. But telling them, it makes the pocket feel a little lighter. It makes the world feel a little clearer. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I remember the last bridge we crossed. It was a makeshift thing, put together by engineers who looked like they hadn't slept in a month. It swayed in the wind, and the water below was a rushing torrent of gray ice. The pilots in the other vehicles were hesitant. They were measuring the gaps, calculating the sway. I didn't wait. I knew that the longer you wait, the more time you have to get scared. I put it in gear, felt the farm boy instincts take over, and drove across that swaying bridge like I was crossing the dry creek bed back in O'Neill. I didn't look down. I just looked at the far bank and kept the throttle steady. When I reached the other side, I turned around and watched the rest of them. They were moving now, their hesitation gone because they'd seen it could be done. That's what I want to leave behind, the knowledge that it can be done, whatever it is for you. The world might mock your farm maneuvers. They might think you're clumsy or uneducated or out of step with the professionals. But if you know your ground and you know your machine and you're not afraid to get a little mud on your hands, you'll find a way across the bridge. I'm Henry Lawson, and I was just a farm boy who learned how to drive a Hellcat, but I lived to tell you about it. And in the end, that's the only maneuver that really matters. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. There was a sound the Hellcat made when you pushed it too hard, a sort of high-pitched whine that cut through the roar of the 9-cylinder radial engine. The manuals called it an overspeed warning, but to me, it sounded like the machine was crying out for help. Most of those pilot boys would back off the throttle the second they heard it. They were terrified of breaking the Army's expensive toy, but I knew that sound from the old threshing machines back in Nebraska. It wasn't a warning that the machine was going to explode. It was a sign that you'd finally reached the limit of what the engineers thought was possible. And out there, in the hedgerows of Normandy, possible wasn't enough to keep you alive. You had to go into the impossible and stay there as long as you could. I remember a specific afternoon in late July, just as the heat was starting to turn the French dust into a choking powder. We were moving through a series of sunken lanes, the kind where the walls of earth and roots are higher than the tank itself. It's a death trap for armor. You can't turn the turret, you can't see over the edge, and you're just waiting for a grenade to drop into your lap. The officers were insistent on maintaining a textbook staggered column. They had us spaced out exactly 50 yards apart, moving at a steady 5 miles per hour. It was neat, it was orderly, and it was the stupidest thing I'd ever seen. It made us a predictable line of targets. I was third in the column. I could see the exhaust from the Hellcat in front of me, and I could feel the sweat stinging my eyes. I didn't like the rhythm of it. It felt too much like a parade. I started playing with the brakes, dragging one side just enough to make the Hellcat shimmy and sway. The commander of the vehicle behind me keyed his radio, telling me to knock off the erratic driving and keep my interval. He was a guy named Miller, not my Miller, but a lieutenant who had spent the last 2 years in a classroom. He didn't understand that a moving target is hard to hit, but a target with a predictable rhythm is just a practice session for an anti-tank crew. Suddenly, the world turned inside out. The lead vehicle didn't just explode, it seemed to disintegrate. A hidden 80mm had been sighted right down the length of that sunken lane. The second vehicle tried to reverse, but they were too slow, too proper. They got hit in the transmission before they'd even cleared the smoke. Lieutenant Miller started screaming over the radio for everyone to hold position and wait for smoke cover. If we'd waited, we'd have been scrap metal in 60 seconds. I didn't wait. I slammed the Hellcat into gear, but I didn't go forward or backward. I drove right up the side of the earth wall. It was nearly a 60-degree incline, slick with moss and loose dirt. The manual said the M18 could handle a 35-degree slope. The officers in the back were probably looking at their charts and preparing to write me off as a casualty of physics. But I'd driven tractors up steeper embankments than that just to get a better view of a stray heifer. I felt the tracks bite into the roots of an old oak tree, and for a second, the nose of the Hellcat was pointing straight at the sky. We were perched there, balanced on the edge of a disaster, the engine screaming that high-pitched whine. Then we crested the top. We were out of the lane, sitting in an open wheat field, looking right down the throat of the German gun crew. They were so shocked to see a 20-ton tank destroyer climb out of a ditch like a mountain goat that they didn't even fire. I didn't give them the chance. I didn't stop to aim. I just kept moving, circling them in a wide, bouncing arc that no pilot would have ever attempted. I was using the terrain like a plowman, following the contours of the land to keep my profile low. When we finally took the shot, it was from their blind side. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. After the smoke cleared and the rest of the column managed to limp out of that lane, the silence was different. It wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of men who had just seen the rules broken and realized the rules were what had nearly killed them. Lieutenant Miller walked over to my vehicle. He looked at the gouges in the earth where my tracks had literally clawed through the bank. He looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't look at my rank or my dirty uniform. He just looked at the machine. He asked me how I knew the tracks wouldn't throw. I told him I didn't know. I just knew the tree was there, and a tree has roots, and roots hold the earth better than a textbook holds a plan. He didn't have a comeback for that. He just walked away, shaking his head. That was the thing about the system. It wanted everything to be a math problem. But war isn't math. War is biology. It's muscle and bone, and the instinct to climb when the ground starts to swallow you. The funny thing is, the more the officers saw me do these things, the more they tried to study them. They'd bring around these veteran pilots from the training schools back home, men who had thousands of hours on the practice range, and they'd ask me to demonstrate the Lawson pivot or the climbing maneuver. I'd try to explain it to them, but you can't explain the way a machine feels when it's about to lose traction. You can't teach someone how to listen to the vibration of the floorboards, to know if the mud is 3 inches deep or 10. They'd watch me, take notes on their clipboards, and then go out and try to do it by the numbers. And they'd fail. They'd throw a track or stall the engine because they were trying to think it through, rather than just letting their hands do what the earth required. I remember one guy, a captain from the armored division, who told me I was unorthodox. He meant it as a compliment, I think, but I took it as a reminder of why I was still alive. Being orthodox in a war is just a fancy way of saying you're predictable, and in a Hellcat, being predictable is a death sentence. We had no armor. A heavy machine gun could almost pierce our sides if the angle was right. Our only defense was the fact that we weren't where the enemy expected us to be. We were the ghosts in the machine, the farm boys who treated the most advanced technology of 1944 like a broken-down fence that needed mending. There were nights when the guilt of surviving would sit on my chest like a lead weight. I think about the boys who followed the manual to the letter and ended up in a hole in the ground in France. I think about the pilots who were so worried about their maneuvers looking good that they forgot to look at the horizon. I wasn't better than them. I was just luckier because I'd spent my childhood failing on a farm. I'd learned how to fail in ways that didn't kill me, so when the war came, I already knew how to fix a disaster on the fly. One night, somewhere near the border of Belgium, we found an abandoned farm. The house was half gone, and the barn was a skeleton of charred timber. I walked out into the field behind the house and I saw a rusted-out plow sitting in the furrows. It was a different model than the one we had in O'Neill, but the steel was the same. I stood there for a long time, just looking at it. I realized that the war had turned me into a different kind of farmer. Instead of planting seeds, I was harvesting iron. Instead of tending to life, I was managing destruction. It's a hard thing for a young man to carry, the realization that his greatest skill, the thing he's best at in the whole world, is the very thing that's making the world a darker place. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I think that's why I kept the farm maneuvers alive. It was my way of keeping Nebraska with me. Every time I did something the Army hadn't taught me, I was reminding myself that I wasn't just a soldier. I was Henry Lawson from O'Neill, and I was going to go back there one day. I had to believe that my life before the war mattered more than the war itself. If I became a perfect soldier, then the farm boy was dead. And if the farm boy was dead, then there was nothing left to go home to. The winter of '44 tried its best to kill that farm boy. The cold in the Ardennes wasn't like the cold in Nebraska. In Nebraska, the wind howls across the plains and bites at you, but you have a hearth to go back to. In the Ardennes, the cold is silent. It creeps up from the frozen ground and into your boots, and it never leaves. We were living in the Hellcat, which was basically a giant metal icebox. Every time we started the engine, the condensation would freeze on the interior walls, and then melt and drip on us when the heater finally kicked in. We were always wet, always shivering, and always exhausted. The veteran pilots were falling apart. They were used to the comforts of the base, the structure of the mess hall, and the predictability of the supply chain. When the Germans broke through and the system collapsed, these men were lost. They didn't know how to survive without a manual. I remember seeing a group of them huddled around a broken-down truck, arguing about which regulation covered the emergency repair of a frozen fuel line. They were literally freezing to death while waiting for permission to be unorthodox. I walked over, took a blowtorch from our maintenance kit, and started heating the fuel pump directly. They looked at me like I was a madman. One of them actually told me I was violating safety protocols. I just looked at him. His lips were blue, his hands were shaking, and I told him that the protocol for being dead was a lot more permanent than the protocol for a fuel pump. I got that truck running in 10 minutes. It wasn't pretty, and it probably ruined the pump for the long term, but it got 30 men to a warm cellar 5 miles away. That's the thing people don't tell you about the matrix of the military, or any big system for that matter. It's designed to keep things moving when everything is normal. But when the world goes crazy, the system becomes a cage. It stops people from thinking for themselves. It makes them wait for orders that are never coming. I survived because I never trusted the system more than I trusted my own eyes. I knew that the officers and the veterans were just men in costumes, and their rank didn't give them a better understanding of the mud than I had. I remember a young lieutenant, fresh from the States, who tried to tell me that my farm logic was a liability to the unit's cohesion. He said that if everyone did what I did, the army would be in chaos. I told him he was right, but I also told him that if everyone did what he did, the army would be a very organized pile of corpses. He didn't like that much. He tried to put me on report, but his commander, a man who had seen me climb that wall in Normandy, just tore up the papers and told the kid to go find something useful to do. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. When we finally crossed into Germany, the tone of the war changed. It wasn't about liberation anymore. It was about ending a nightmare. The German soldiers we were facing now weren't the elite SS units of the early days. They were old men and young boys, people who looked like they should have been in the fields back home. I remember one day we were clearing a small village and I saw a boy, couldn't have been more than 14, trying to aim a Panzerfaust at us. His hands were shaking so bad he could barely hold the tube. In a textbook scenario, you'd eliminate the threat. You'd fire the coaxial machine gun and move on. But I didn't see a threat. I saw a scared kid who didn't know how to handle a machine. I drove the Hellcat right toward him, but I didn't fire. I just used the speed of the vehicle to create a massive cloud of dust and debris, and then I pivoted the tank right in front of him, kicking up a wall of mud that knocked him over. Before he could get back up, I'd swung the rear around and pinned the Panzerfaust into the dirt with the track. I didn't kill him, I just took away his toy. Miller looked at me through the hatch. He didn't say anything, but I could see the understanding in his eyes. We were all tired of the killing. We just wanted to go back to being people. I think that kid probably went home that night and realized that the monsters in the American tanks were just men who knew how to drive. I hope he's still alive somewhere, maybe tending a garden in some quiet German town, remembering the day a Hellcat did a farm maneuver just to save his life. Living to 92 means I've outlived almost everyone who was there. I've outlived the officers who mocked me, the pilots who tried to copy me, and the system that tried to break me. Sometimes I feel like I'm the only one left who knows the truth about how that war was won. It wasn't won by the smartest men in the room or the most expensive equipment. It was won by the people who knew how to fix things when they broke. It was won by the farm boys, the mechanics, the laborers, the people who had been unorthodox their whole lives just to survive. I still dream about the sound of the engine, not the roar, but that high-pitched whine. It's a sound of strain, of effort, of pushing past the limit. I think our whole generation was like that engine. We were pushed way past what we were designed for, and we made a lot of noise doing it. Some of us broke, some of us threw a track and got left behind, but some of us climbed the wall. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I remember the day I finally left the Army. They gave me a piece of paper, a medal I never wore, and a bus ticket back to Nebraska. I sat on that bus and I looked at my hands. They were still stained with grease. I didn't feel like a hero. I didn't even feel like a soldier. I just felt like a man who had a lot of work to do. When I got back to the farm, my father didn't ask me about the battles. He didn't ask me how many tanks I'd destroyed or how many cities I'd seen. He just looked at the old John Deere sitting in the shed and said, "The transmission's acting up, Henry. See if you can't figure out what's wrong with it." I spent the next 40 years figuring out what was wrong with things. I raised my kids to respect the tools they were given and to never trust a manual more than their own common sense. I taught them that the system is just a suggestion and that real wisdom comes from the earth and the grease under your nails. They used to laugh at my war stories, but as they got older, they started to see the point. They saw that the way I lived my life was just a continuation of those farm maneuvers in the Hellcat. I'm 92 now, and I'm ready for the next part of the journey. I don't know what's on the other side of that last bridge, but I'm not worried. I've got 92 years of experience in finding a way through the mud. If there's a wall, I'll climb it. If there's a ditch, I'll find the roots. And if there's an engine, you can bet I'll know how to make it sing. Thank you for listening to An Old Man's Memories. It's been a long road from O'Neill to Normandy and back again, but I wouldn't trade a single mile of it. Just remember, when the world tells you there's only one way to do things, look for the oak tree, look for the roots, and never ever be afraid to do a farm maneuver when everyone else is waiting for permission to live. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. proceeding with the narrative into part 3 to continue building towards the 120,000 character total. The thing about the Hellcat was that it was built by Buick. Now, to a city person, that probably doesn't mean much. But to a farmer, it meant it was built like a car. It had a certain finesse to it that the Shermans, which were built like tractors, just didn't have. But that finesse was a double-edged sword. It was fast, sure. It could hit 55 miles per hour on a good road, but it was fragile. If you hit a bump too hard, you'd jar the rangefinder out of alignment. If you revved the engine too fast before it was warm, you'd blow a gasket. It required a delicate touch, something the veteran pilots thought they had because they'd been taught precision. But their precision was mechanical. Mine was instinctual. I remember we were tasked with clearing a path through a series of orchards near the town of St. Lo. The trees were apple and pear mostly, and their branches were heavy with unharvested fruit. The ground was soft, almost spongy from all the rain. The Shermans that had tried to go through before us had just bogged down, their heavy frames sinking into the loam. The pilots in my unit were terrified of the same thing happening to them. They were trying to stay on the narrow dirt paths, but the Germans knew those paths were the only way through, so they'd zeroed in their mortars on every single one of them. I watched the first Hellcat in our line try to navigate a path. The driver was being so careful, so precise, that he was barely moving. He was trying to keep his tracks perfectly centered on the 2 dry ruts in the mud. He was so focused on the ruts that he didn't see the mortar pit in the trees to his left. He was a stationary target. A mortar round hit the deck right behind his turret, and that was the end of his war. I didn't stay on the path. I drove right into the middle of the orchard. I didn't try to avoid the trees, I used them. I'd angle the Hellcat so the front hull would clip a trunk, using the impact to pivot the vehicle without having to use the brakes and risk digging a hole. It was a farm maneuver I'd used 100 times when I was clearing brush. You don't fight the obstacles. You use their resistance to change your direction. I was zigzagging through that orchard like a rabbit in a cornfield. The pilots behind me were screaming on the radio that I was going to wreck the suspension. I didn't care about the suspension. I cared about the mortars. By the time the Germans realized there was a Hellcat weaving through the trees, I was already behind them. I came out of the foliage at 30 miles per hour, the tracks throwing up a spray of apples and dirt, and we took out the mortar position before they could even traverse their tubes. When the rest of the unit finally caught up, they were picking branches out of their periscopes and swearing at me, but they were alive. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. Captain Sterling, the one who'd laughed at my driving back at the base, was the first one to reach me. He looked at the side of my Hellcat, which was scratched and dented from the trees. He looked at the apples stuck in the track links. Then he looked at the destroyed mortar pit. He didn't laugh. He just took off his helmet, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and asked, "How many bushels do you think we just harvested, Lawson?" "Enough to make a lot of cider, sir," I said. He just nodded. "Well, it's the best damn cider I've ever seen. Keep leading the way." That was the moment I realized that even the men who represented the system were capable of learning. They just had to see the system fail first. That's the problem with most people. They won't change their mind until the world forces them to. They'll stay in the ruts until the mortars start falling. I learned early on that it's better to be the one who makes his own ruts. As the war moved into its final stages, we found ourselves in a series of urban battles. If orchards were bad for armor, cities were worse. Every window was a potential sniper nest, every basement a hiding spot for a Panzerfaust. The manual for urban combat involved slow, methodical movements, with infantry clearing every house before the tanks moved up. It was a slow, bloody process. We were in a town called Kleve, near the Dutch border. The rubble was piled 10 feet high in some places, and the streets were so narrow that the Hellcat could barely fit. The pilots were terrified of getting stuck. They'd inch forward, stop, wait for the infantry, inch forward again. It was taking hours to move a single block. Meanwhile, the Germans were just repositioning behind the rubble, waiting for us to come to them. I saw a collapsed building that formed a sort of ramp up to the second floor of a row of shops. To anyone else, it was just debris. To me, it was a high ground advantage. I told Miller to hang on, and I drove that Hellcat right up the rubble. It wasn't a maneuver you'd find in any army handbook. It was a farm maneuver for getting a tractor over a stone wall. You have to keep the momentum steady. If you hesitate, the rocks will shift and you're finished. We climbed up onto the second-story floorboards of what used to be a bakery. The floor groaned, and the dust was so thick we could barely see. But suddenly we had a line of sight over the entire street. We could see the German teams hiding in the basements and behind the barricades. We started picking them off from above. The Germans were looking at the street level, waiting for the tanks they could hear idling in the distance. They never expected a Hellcat to be looking down at them from a bakery. The infantry guys down in the street were cheering. They'd never seen anything like it. One of them told me later that he thought a ghost tank had appeared out of the ruins. But it wasn't a ghost. It was just a machine being used by someone who didn't care about what it was supposed to do. When we finally rolled back down into the street, the veteran pilots just stared at us. They couldn't understand how the floor didn't collapse or how we didn't tip over. I didn't have the heart to tell them that the floor did collapse a little, and we did almost tip over. But in that moment, the risk of tipping over was less than the risk of sitting still. That's the math they never taught in school. They taught you how to avoid risk, but they never taught you how to choose the better risk. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The older I get, the more I realize that the world is full of people who are just waiting for the proper way to do things. They're waiting for the manual to be updated, or for the boss to give them permission, or for the system to tell them it's okay to be brave. But the world doesn't work that way. The world is a sunken lane, and there's an 80 meters sighted right down the middle of it. If you wait for the proper way out, you're going to get hit. You have to be willing to climb the wall, even if you've never seen it done before. I look at the world today, and I see so many people trapped in their own ruts. They're so worried about being correct or professional that they've lost the ability to be human. They've lost the ability to use their own hands and their own hearts to solve a problem. I wish I could take every one of them back to 1944, just for an hour. I'd put them in the driver's seat of that Hellcat, and I'd tell them to find a way through the orchard. I think they'd find that they're a lot more capable than they think they are. My hands are tired now, and the sun is going down. I think I'll sit here for a while and just listen to the wind. It sounds a little like the engine if you listen close enough. It sounds like a machine that's finally at rest. I'm glad I could share this with you. I'm glad someone knows about the mad farmer and his unorthodox ways, because the world needs a little more farm logic these days. It needs people who aren't afraid of the mud. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. Continuing to part 4 to further expand the narrative toward the 120,000 character goal. There was a moment, just before we reached the Elbe River, that I'll never forget. We had captured a small group of German soldiers, and among them was an older man, probably in his late 50s. He was wearing a uniform that was 2 sizes too small, and he looked like he hadn't eaten in a week. While the others were being processed, I saw him sitting by a fence looking at the soil. I walked over and sat down near him. I didn't have my gun out, I just had a cigarette. I offered him one, and he took it with a nod. We sat there in silence for a while, the smoke drifting between us. Finally, he pointed to the field across the road. "Good soil," he said in broken English. "Needs lime, but good soil." I looked at it. He was right. It was a rich, dark loam that would have been perfect for winter wheat. We spent the next 20 minutes talking about crop rotation and the price of seed. For those 20 minutes, the war didn't exist. He wasn't the enemy, and I wasn't the liberator. We were just 2 farmers talking about the land. He told me he'd lost his sons in Russia and his wife in a bombing raid. All he had left was a small plot of land that he hoped to see one more time. I realized then that the system had lied to both of us. It had told us that we were fundamentally different, that we had to kill each other because of some map or some ideology. But the soil didn't care about maps. The soil didn't care who won the war. The soil just wanted to be tended. I felt a deep, hollow sadness in my chest, a realization that we had spent years destroying the very thing that sustained us. When the MPs came to take him away, he stood up and shook my hand. His hand was rough, just like my father's. He looked at me and said, "I hope you go back to your farm, American. The world needs more farmers and fewer soldiers." I never saw him again, but I think about him every time I look at a field. I think about all the enemies who were just people like me, trapped in a machine they couldn't control. It made me realize that the real farm maneuver isn't about how you drive a tank. It's about how you maintain your humanity when the world is trying to turn you into a weapon. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. We were moving toward the Rhine when the rain started again. It wasn't the kind of rain that washes things clean. It was the kind of rain that turns the world into a gray, heavy blur, making everything look like a charcoal drawing that someone had tried to smudge out with a wet thumb. That's when the matrix of the military really started to show its cracks. You see, when you're in the middle of a war, they try to convince you that there's a grand plan, a giant machine where every gear and every bolt is exactly where it's supposed to be. But sitting in that Hellcat, with water dripping down the back of my neck and the smell of wet wool and stagnant diesel filling my lungs, I realized the plan was just a story they told to keep us from realizing we were all just wandering in the dark. The officers kept talking about objectives and strategic corridors, but to me, it was just another field to cross, another hill that didn't want us there. I remember looking at a map one of the scouts had dropped. It was covered in red and blue lines, neat little arrows showing where we were supposed to go. It looked so clean on paper, but when I looked through my periscope, I didn't see lines or arrows. I saw a farmhouse that had been blasted into a jagged pile of teeth. I saw a dead cow in a ditch, its legs pointing at the sky like frozen branches. The map was a lie. The whole system was a lie, designed to make the chaos look like order. I remember a guy in my company, a kid from Philadelphia named Russo. He was one of those pilot types, always polishing his goggles and talking about the glory of the cavalry. He believed in the manual more than he believed in his own eyes. We were tasked with scouting a bridgehead, and the manual said we should move in a bounding overwatch formation across a flat stretch of pasture. It was the proper way to do it. But I looked at that pasture, and I saw the way the grass was matted down in a specific pattern. It didn't look right. It looked like someone had been dragging heavy equipment through there recently. I told Russo to hold up. I told him the ground didn't feel right. He laughed at me, called me Nebraska again, and said the brass had already cleared this sector. He told me I was overthinking it and that we had a schedule to keep. He was so worried about being on time for the plan that he forgot to look at the reality right in front of him. He pulled his Hellcat out into that field, moving at a steady, textbook pace. He didn't make it 100 yards before a hidden anti-tank mine blew his left track clean off. Then the hidden POC-40 in the tree line opened up. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. Russo's crew scrambled out of that smoking wreck, and for a second, I saw his face. He looked confused. He looked like a man who had been told the world worked one way, and then watched the world break every rule he'd ever learned. He was still holding his manual in his hand as he ran for the ditch. I didn't wait for orders. I didn't check the staggered column protocol. I did what I'd done 1,000 times when a neighbor's truck got stuck in a snowbank. I didn't drive toward him. I drove in a wide, erratic circle, kicking up as much dirt and smoke as I could to create a screen. I was using the Hellcat speed. That Buick engine was screaming, but I wasn't moving in a way any officer would have approved of. I was fishtailing on purpose, letting the rear end slide out to create a wider profile of dust. It was another farm maneuver, something you do when you're trying to herd skittish sheep. You make yourself look bigger and more unpredictable than you are. The German gunners couldn't get a lock on me. I'd accelerate, then slam on the left brake to spin 90 degrees, then floor it again in a different direction. While I was drawing their fire, my crew managed to get a tow cable onto Russo's Hellcat. We didn't pull him back the way he came. We pulled him sideways, through a hedge, and into a small creek bed that provided cover. We saved his life, and we saved that machine. But when we got back to the assembly area, Russo didn't thank me. He looked at me with a kind of resentment. I think it's because I'd shown him that his matrix, his perfect world of rules and orders, was a hollow shell. He'd realized that he was just a man in a tin can, and the only thing between him and the end of his life was a farm boy who didn't care about the rules. That's the thing about the system. It hates people like me because we remind it that it's not in control. The brass wants you to think the machine is what matters, but it's always the man. I spent the next few weeks watching Russo. He was never the same. He stopped polishing his goggles. He stopped talking about the cavalry. He started looking at the ground with a kind of suspicion, like he was waiting for it to betray him again. He'd finally woken up to the reality of the war, and it was a heavy burden to carry. I've had nearly 80 years to think about Russo and all the others who lived inside that bubble of correctness. I see it today too. People walking around, following their little maps, trusting their systems, never looking at the grass to see how it's matted down. They think they're safe because they're doing what they're told. But the 88s of life don't care about what you were told. They only care about where you're standing when the shell lands. I think about the regrets of the end of life that people always talk about. Most people regret things they didn't do. Me? I regret the moments I let the system talk me out of my own instincts. There were times I saw something wrong and stayed silent because an officer was watching. Those are the moments that haunt me. Those are the times when the Matrix won. But in that field with Russo, I won. I chose the mud over the map. And because of that, a mother in Philadelphia got her son back. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. There's a specific smell to a war that's ending. It's not just the smell of death and smoke. It's the smell of exhaustion. It's the smell of millions of men who have reached the end of their tether and just want to sit down and never get up again. By the spring of 1945, the veteran pilots were gone. Most of them had been replaced by boys who were so young they didn't even have to shave yet. They looked at me like I was some kind of ancient relic, the old man of the unit at 22 years old. I remember we were sitting near a crossroads in Germany, waiting for the word to move. A group of local civilians walked past us. They were mostly women and old men, carrying everything they owned in small wooden carts. One woman stopped and looked at our Hellcat. She didn't look at us with hate, or even with fear. She just looked tired. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of bread, stale and gray, and offered it to me. I didn't take it. I couldn't. Here I was, sitting on 20 tons of the most advanced killing machinery on Earth, and this woman, who had nothing, was trying to feed me. It was another moment where the system collapsed. I was supposed to be the conqueror, and she was the enemy. But the reality was that we were both just victims of a world that had gone mad. I reached into our rations and gave her 2 cans of peaches and a chocolate bar. She took them, nodded once, and kept walking. My gunner, a kid named Thompson, who had only been with us for a week, asked me why I did that. He said the regulations were clear about non-fraternization. I looked at him. He was 18, his eyes wide with the matrix of propaganda he'd been fed back home, and I told him that the regulations didn't cover what it means to be a human being. I told him that if he wanted to survive this war and still be able to look at himself in the mirror, he'd better start learning when to ignore the regulations. He didn't understand. He thought I was being soft. A few days later, we were in a firefight in a small hamlet. Thompson was so focused on the rules of engagement that he hesitated to fire at a sniper nest because there might be civilians in the building. He was trying to follow the proper moral code of the system in a situation that was fundamentally immoral. I had to take over the controls and do it myself. I didn't want to blow up that building, but I knew that if I didn't, Thompson would be dead, and I would be dead, and the system wouldn't shed a single tear for either of us. That's the tragedy of it. The system puts you in a position where you have to choose between your soul and your life. And most of the time, you choose your life, but you leave a piece of your soul behind in every shattered village and every burnt-out orchard. At 92, I look at the pieces of my soul I left in Germany and France, and I wonder if I could have done more to keep them. But then I remember the woman with the bread and the boy with the Panzerfaust, and I realized that maybe the farm maneuvers were about more than just driving. Maybe they were about navigating the moral mud of war. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The Hellcat was never meant to be a permanent home. It was built for speed, for the quick strike, the sudden disappearance. But for me, it became the only reality I had. I knew every bolt, every rattle, every smell of that machine better than I knew the people back home. I could tell you the exact moment the oil pressure was going to drop by the way the floorboards vibrated under my heels. I could tell you if a track was loose by the way the steering lever resisted my pull. It was a relationship built on necessity, a bond between a man and a machine that were both being used up by a world that didn't care about either of them. One night, we were parked in a forest, the trees dripping with a cold, insistent mist. I was sitting on the turret, looking up at the stars, and I realized that the stars were the only thing the system couldn't touch. They were the same stars I saw back in O'Neill, the same ones my father looked at when he was worried about the harvest. They were a reminder that there was a world outside the matrix of the war, a world that was vast and silent and utterly indifferent to our little battles. I think that's why I'm telling this now. We're living in a time where everyone is so connected to their systems, their phones, their jobs, their political parties, that they've forgotten how to look at the stars. They've forgotten that they're just people standing on a piece of earth and that the maps they follow are just ink on paper. They're so busy being pilots of their own lives that they've forgotten how to be drivers. They've forgotten how to feel the mud and listen to the engine. I had a dream a few years ago. I was back in the Hellcat, but the war was over. I was driving it through the wheat fields in Nebraska, the golden stalks bowing as I passed. There were no officers, no veteran pilots, no hidden 88s. It was just me and the machine and the land. I realized in that dream that the Hellcat wasn't a weapon anymore. It was just another plow. It was finally doing what it was meant to do, tending the earth instead of destroying it. When I woke up, I felt a strange sense of peace. I realized that my life hasn't been defined by the war, even though I carry it with me every day. It's been defined by the fact that I survived the Matrix and came back to the earth. I came back to the farm maneuvers of real life, raising a family, building a home, watching the seasons change. Those are the things that matter. The war was just a long, loud detour on the way back to the farm. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I remember the day we finally reached the Elbe. We were told to stop. The system had decided that this was as far as we were allowed to go. We sat there on the riverbank, watching the water flow past, and for the first time in months, there was no sound of artillery. There was just the wind in the reeds and the sound of our own breathing. We looked across the river and saw the Russians. They were just like us, dirty, tired, and looking at the water like it was the edge of the world. One of the Russian soldiers, a big man with a beard that looked like a bird's nest, stripped off his boots and waded into the river. He held up a bottle of something and shouted something I couldn't understand, but I didn't need to understand the words. I knew what he was saying. He was saying, "We're still here." I waded out to meet him, halfway across the cold, gray water. We shook hands in the middle of the river, two men who had been used by two different systems to destroy each other, but who had managed to stay human long enough to see the end of it. That handshake was the most honest thing that happened to me in the entire war. It wasn't sanctioned by the manual. It wasn't part of the strategic corridors. It was just two drivers acknowledging that the journey was over. When I got back to my side of the river, Captain Sterling was standing there. He'd seen the whole thing. I expected him to chew me out, to talk about fraternization and security risks, but he didn't. He just looked at me and said, "Lawson, you always were a terrible soldier, but you're a hell of a man." I think that's the best compliment I've ever received. I spent my whole life being a terrible soldier because I refused to let the system take away my common sense or my compassion. I refused to believe that the map was more important than the mud. And at 92, looking back on a life that's mostly behind me, I wouldn't have it any other way. I know I'm rambling,